The kitchen clock struck 6 as Dorothy Williams wiped her weathered hands on her favorite apron, the one with tiny roses that Harold had given her 40 years ago. At 78, her fingers weren't as nimble as they once were, but she had spent the entire afternoon preparing what used to be the family's favorite meal: pot roast with all the fixings, homemade biscuits, and her famous apple pie. The dining room table was set with her best china, the same set she'd received as a wedding gift. Each plate positioned perfectly, each napkin folded with care. This was how Sunday dinners used to be when Harold was alive, when the house buzzed with genuine laughter and love. "Mom, we're here," called her son Marcus as he walked through the front door without knocking. Behind him trailed his wife Jennifer and their 2 teenagers, Kyle and Madison. Gone were the days when they'd hug her at the door or compliment the aroma wafting from the kitchen. "Dinner's ready," Dorothy announced softly, her voice carrying the hope she felt every Sunday that maybe this time would be different. Maybe this time they'd appreciate the hours she'd spent cooking, the way she'd gotten up early despite her arthritis to make fresh biscuits from scratch. Jennifer rolled her eyes as she looked at the spread. "Seriously, Dorothy? This heavy food again? Don't you know we're trying to eat healthy?" Madison's trying to maintain her figure for cheerleading. 16-year-old Madison wrinkled her nose. "Grandma, this looks so old-fashioned. Like, who even eats pot roast anymore? It's literally dripping with grease." Dorothy felt the familiar sting of their criticism, but she forced a smile. "I made it just the way your grandfather liked it. The way Marcus loved it when he was your age." "Yeah, well, that was a long time ago, Mom," Marcus said, not even looking up from his phone. "We've evolved since then." Kyle, barely looking away from his video game, added, "This stuff is probably loaded with cholesterol and sodium. My health teacher says this kind of food is why old people have so many problems." The words hit Dorothy like physical blows. Old people. As if she wasn't sitting right there. As if her years of sacrifice and love could be dismissed so casually. I thought we could have a nice family dinner," Dorothy whispered, her voice barely audible. Jennifer laughed. Not a kind laugh, but the sharp, mocking sound that had become too familiar. "A family dinner? Dorothy, look at this food. It's 2024, not 1954. Nobody wants to eat like this anymore." What happened next would replay in Dorothy's mind for weeks. Jennifer stood up, grabbed Dorothy's carefully prepared plate, and walked to the kitchen. The sound of the garbage disposal grinding filled the house as Jennifer scraped the entire meal into the sink. "There," Jennifer announced, returning to the dining room. "Now we can order something decent. Kids, what do you want? Sushi? Thai food?" But they weren't done. Madison, encouraged by her mother's cruelty, picked up the homemade biscuits and began tossing them into the trash can one by one. "These look like hockey pucks anyway," she giggled. Kyle joined in, dumping the green beans Dorothy had spent an hour preparing. "Yeah, this is where this belongs." The final humiliation came when Jennifer grabbed Dorothy's apple pie, the one she'd started at 5 in the morning, rolling the dough by hand because Harold had always said store-bought crusts tasted like cardboard. Jennifer held it up dramatically and then dropped it directly into the garbage can. "Oops," she said with mock innocence as the pie tin clattered against the other discarded food. "Butterfingers." The family erupted in laughter. Even Marcus, her own son, chuckled as he continued scrolling through his phone, completely indifferent to his mother's humiliation. Dorothy stood frozen in her own dining room, surrounded by the empty plates and the sound of their laughter. The house that had once been filled with love and gratitude now echoed with cruelty and disrespect. The woman who had raised these children, who had worked 2 jobs after Harold died to keep the family together, who had sacrificed everything for their happiness, watched as they treated her life's work like garbage. Something inside Dorothy Williams cracked that day. Not broke, she was too strong for that. But something fundamental shifted, like a foundation settling after years of pressure. She looked around at the faces of her family, people she had loved unconditionally, and realized they saw her as nothing more than an inconvenience. As they ordered expensive takeout on her credit card and complained about her outdated furniture, Dorothy quietly began clearing the table. But deep in her chest, A small flame of determination began to grow. They had forgotten something important. Something that would change everything. This was still her house. The next morning, Dorothy sat in Harold's old recliner, holding a cup of tea that had long gone cold. The living room looked different now. Jennifer had rearranged everything without asking, replacing Dorothy's cherished family photos with trendy artwork and throwing her handmade doilies into storage. She remembered when this house was their sanctuary. Harold had worked double shifts at the factory for 15 years to pay off the mortgage early. They'd painted every room together, planted the garden that still bloomed each spring, and filled every corner with memories of birthday parties, Christmas mornings, and quiet evenings watching the sunset from the front porch. Now it felt like she was a guest in her own home, and an unwelcome one at that. Dorothy. Jennifer's voice cut through her memories like a blade. We need to talk about this thermostat situation. 72 degrees is wasteful and expensive. We're setting it at 68. Dorothy looked up to see Jennifer standing with her hands on her hips, as if Dorothy were a child being scolded. But I get cold, Jennifer. My arthritis. Then wear a sweater. We're not heating the whole house for one person's comfort when there are 5 of us living here. 5 of us living here. The words stung because they revealed the truth Dorothy had been trying to ignore. In their minds, they weren't visiting her house. They were living in their house, and she was the burden they had to tolerate. Jennifer, this is still Your what? Your house. Jennifer's laugh was cold. Dorothy, let's be honest. You can barely take care of yourself. Marcus and I pay most of the bills now. We do the yard work. We handle the maintenance. We make sure everything runs smoothly. You just exist here. The cruelty of the words took Dorothy's breath away. She thought about the Social Security checks she signed over each month to help with expenses, the insurance money from Harold's policy that had paid for Marcus's college education, the countless babysitting hours she'd provided for free when the children were small. I raised Marcus in this house, Dorothy said quietly. I raised him here after his father died, working 2 jobs to keep us afloat. That was your job as a parent, Jennifer interrupted. You don't get a Lifetime Achievement Award for doing what you were supposed to do. And frankly, Dorothy, that was decades ago. What have you contributed lately? Dorothy felt the familiar burn of tears behind her eyes, but she refused to cry in front of Jennifer. Instead, she stood up slowly and walked to the window that overlooked Harold's garden. The roses were blooming, the same variety they'd planted for their 10th anniversary. That evening, Dorothy overheard a conversation that would haunt her dreams. She'd gone to the kitchen for a glass of water when she heard Jennifer's voice from the living room. I'm telling you, Marcus, she's becoming more difficult every day, complaining about the temperature, acting like she owns the place. She does own the place, Jen. Legally, I mean. Jennifer's voice dropped to a whisper, but the house was old, and sound carried. Not for much longer if we play this right. She's getting older, more confused. It would be easy to convince people she's not capable of making decisions anymore. And when she's gone, well, you're the only heir. Dorothy's hand gripped the kitchen counter as the room seemed to spin around her. They weren't just disrespecting her. They were planning to take everything Harold had worked for, everything he'd left to ensure she'd be cared for in her golden years. I don't know, Jen. That feels wrong. Wrong? What's wrong is letting this house go to waste when we could be building equity, making improvements. Look at this place, Marcus. It's stuck in the past because she won't let us modernize anything. When the kids graduate and go to college, we could sell this place and buy something really nice. Dorothy stood in the darkness of her kitchen, listening to her family plan her erasure. They spoke about her as if she were already gone, as if her life and memories and 40 years in this house meant nothing. She looked at Harold's photograph on the refrigerator. Their wedding day, both of them young and hopeful and desperately in love. Harold had always been her protector, her advocate, her strength. But Harold was gone, and Dorothy was on her own. Walking quietly back to her bedroom, she stopped at Harold's old desk and opened the bottom drawer. There, in a manila folder labeled House, were the original deed and mortgage papers. She pulled them out with trembling hands and read the names on the deed. Harold Williams and Dorothy Williams, husband and wife. When Harold died, the house had passed entirely to her. Marcus's name appeared nowhere on these papers. Jennifer's certainly didn't. Dorothy held the deed against her chest and whispered to Harold's photograph, "Maybe it's time I remind them whose name is on these papers." For the first time in months, Dorothy Williams smiled. Dorothy spent the next morning in Harold's study, surrounded by documents she hadn't looked at in years. Bank statements, insurance papers, the deed to the house, Harold's will, everything meticulously organized the way her late husband had left it. Harold had been careful about their finances, perhaps more careful than she'd realized. The life insurance policy had paid off not just the mortgage, but had left a substantial savings account that Dorothy had barely touched. Her Social Security, combined with Harold's pension, was more than enough to maintain the house and live comfortably. She'd been signing those checks over to Marcus because he'd convinced her it was helping the family. But looking at the numbers now, Dorothy realized she'd been subsidizing their lifestyle while they treated her like a charity case. The phone rang, startling her from her calculations. The caller ID showed a number she hadn't seen in months: George Whitmore, Harold's old friend and the lawyer who had handled their estate planning. "Dorothy? This is George Whitmore. I was just thinking about you and Harold, wondering how you're getting along." "George." Dorothy's voice brightened for the first time in weeks. "How wonderful to hear from you. I was just looking through some of Harold's papers." "Oh, nothing wrong, I hope?" Dorothy hesitated. George had been Harold's friend long before he became their lawyer. He'd been a guest at their wedding, had come to Marcus's graduation, had held Dorothy's hand at Harold's funeral. If anyone would understand, it would be George. "George, I need to ask you something about the house. About my rights." There was a pause. "Dorothy, are you in some kind of trouble?" The kindness in his voice nearly broke her composure. I think my family believes they own this house. They make decisions about everything: the temperature, the furniture, the food. They act like I'm a guest who's overstayed her welcome." "Dorothy, you know that house is yours, right?" "Completely and entirely yours. When Harold passed, it transferred to you with no encumbrances. No one else has any legal claim to it. But Marcus is my son. Being your son doesn't give him property rights, Dorothy. That house is yours to do with as you please. You can live in it, rent it, sell it, or yes, you can ask people to leave, even family members." Dorothy felt a surge of something she hadn't experienced in months: power. Even if they've been helping with expenses? Especially then. If they've been contributing to household expenses, that makes them tenants at best. And tenants can be evicted with proper notice. Evicted. Dorothy repeated the word softly. It sounded harsh, final, but also liberating. "Dorothy, is there something you're not telling me? Are you safe there?" Safe. What an interesting question. Was she safe in her own home? Safe from physical harm? Yes. But safe from emotional abuse, from having her dignity stripped away daily, from watching her life's work thrown in the garbage? "I don't think I am, George. I think they're waiting for me to not be here anymore, so they can have the house." "Well, they're going to have a very long wait, and they're going to be disappointed." "Dorothy, would you like me to come by? We could review your options." "Yes," Dorothy said with more conviction than she'd felt in years. "Yes, I would like that very much." After hanging up, Dorothy walked through her house with new eyes. This wasn't Marcus's house or Jennifer's house. This was Dorothy Williams's house. Every mortgage payment had been made by her and Harold. Every improvement had been paid for with their money, their labor, their dreams. She stopped in the kitchen and looked at the spot where Jennifer had scraped her pot roast into the garbage disposal. She remembered the sound of her biscuits hitting the trash can, the sight of her apple pie discarded like refuse. Opening the drawer where she kept important papers, Dorothy pulled out a notebook and began making a list. George had mentioned proper notice. She wanted to understand exactly what that meant. The front door slammed, signaling Jennifer's return from her shopping trip, shopping funded by Dorothy's monthly contribution to household expenses. "Dorothy," Jennifer called out imperiously, "I need you to move your car. I bought some new patio furniture, and the delivery truck, needs to get into the driveway. New patio furniture. Purchased without consulting Dorothy. For Dorothy's patio. With Dorothy's money. Coming, Jennifer. Dorothy called back, but her voice carried a note Jennifer had never heard before. It sounded almost confident. Dorothy looked once more at the deed in her hands, at Harold's signature next to hers, at the date they'd signed it together 43 years ago. "This house is mine," she whispered to Harold's photograph. "And they're going to know it." Dorothy had spent 3 sleepless nights thinking about her conversation with George Whitmore. He'd visited the day before, reviewing her options with the patience of an old friend and the precision of an experienced attorney. The law was clear. She owned the house outright and had every right to determine who lived there. But George had also been gentle in explaining the emotional complexity of evicting family members. "You don't have to decide today, Dorothy," he'd said. "But you do have options if the situation becomes unbearable." Unbearable. That word echoed in Dorothy's mind as she prepared breakfast. Marcus and Jennifer had gone out the night before without telling her where or when they'd be back. They'd taken her car, again, without asking. And they'd left their dirty dishes in the sink with a note. "Dorothy, please take care of these. Thanks. Please." As if it were a request rather than an expectation. When they returned from their night out, Dorothy was waiting in the living room. She'd rehearsed what she wanted to say, how she wanted to approach this reasonably and calmly. "Marcus, Jennifer, could we sit down and talk?" Jennifer looked annoyed at the interruption. "Can it wait, Dorothy? We're tired, and I have things to do tomorrow." "It's important," Dorothy said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. Marcus sank into Harold's recliner, the chair he'd claimed as his own despite Dorothy's gentle protests. Jennifer perched on the edge of the sofa, checking her phone. "I've been thinking about our living arrangement," Dorothy began carefully. "And I feel like we need to establish some guidelines, some mutual respect." Jennifer looked up from her phone with raised eyebrows. "Guidelines? This is my house," Dorothy said quietly. "I know you both contribute to expenses, and I'm grateful for that. But I still live here too, and I'd like to be consulted about decisions that affect our home." Marcus shifted uncomfortably. "Mom, what's this about?" "It's about the thermostat being changed without asking me. It's about my furniture being moved and my belongings being put away without my permission. It's about..." Dorothy's voice caught slightly, but she pressed on. "It's about feeling like a stranger in my own home." Jennifer's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "Oh, please, Dorothy. You're being overly dramatic. We're trying to make this house more comfortable for everyone. If you can't handle a few reasonable changes..." Reasonable? The word came out louder than Dorothy intended. "Is it reasonable to throw away a meal I spent all day preparing? Is it reasonable to rearrange my living room without asking? Is it reasonable to take my car without telling me where you're going?" "Your car?" Jennifer stood up, her voice rising. "Dorothy, that car sits in the driveway 90% of the time. You barely drive anymore. We're actually using it, maintaining it, putting gas in it." "With my money," Dorothy said quietly. The room went silent. Marcus looked between his wife and his mother, clearly uncomfortable with the confrontation. "What's that supposed to mean?" Jennifer's voice had turned dangerously cold. Dorothy took a deep breath. "I've been looking at my finances, Jennifer. I've been very generous with my contributions to this household. But generosity shouldn't come with the price of being disrespected in my own home." "Disrespected?" Jennifer's voice pitched higher. "Dorothy, we do everything around here. We pay bills, we maintain the house, we take care of problems. All you do is sit around and complain about how things used to be better when Harold was alive." The mention of Harold's name in that context was like a physical blow. Dorothy felt tears spring to her eyes, but underneath the hurt was something else, something that felt like steel forming in her backbone. "Harold worked his entire life to pay for this house," Dorothy said, her voice trembling but determined. "We both did. And I won't have his memory or his sacrifice disrespected." Jennifer rolled her eyes. "Here we go with the Harold worship again. Dorothy, Harold's been dead for 8 years. It's time to join the present." That was the moment Dorothy knew the conversation was hopeless. That was the moment She realized Jennifer would never see her as anything more than an obstacle to be managed. And looking at Marcus, who sat silently allowing his wife to speak to his mother this way, Dorothy understood that he had already chosen his side. "If you can't treat me with respect in my own home," Dorothy said quietly, "then maybe you should consider finding your own home." The silence that followed was deafening. Then Jennifer burst into laughter. Not amused laughter, but the kind of cruel laughter that's meant to wound. "Are you threatening to kick us out, Dorothy? Really?" Jennifer's voice dripped with condescension. "Where exactly do you think you'd be without us? Who would help you when you fall? Who would drive you to doctor's appointments? Who would make sure the bills get paid?" Marcus finally spoke up, but not in Dorothy's defense. "Mom, I think you're getting a little carried away here. We're family. We work these things out together." Dorothy looked at her son, really looked at him, and saw a man who had become a stranger. The little boy she'd raised, the young man she'd sacrificed for, the son she'd loved unconditionally, was looking at her like she was an inconvenience. "You're right, Marcus," Dorothy said softly. "Families should work things out together. Families should respect each other. Families should appreciate each other." She stood up slowly, her arthritis protesting, but her resolve strengthening. "I'm going to bed now. We can continue this conversation when everyone has had time to think about what family really means." As Dorothy walked to her bedroom, she heard Jennifer's voice behind her. "She's losing it, Marcus. This is exactly what I was talking about. We might need to start looking into options." Options. Dorothy knew exactly what Jennifer meant by options. In her bedroom, Dorothy sat at Harold's old desk and pulled out a piece of stationery. At the top, she wrote, "Notice to vacate," in Harold's careful handwriting style. Then she stopped, her hand trembling. Was she really going to do this? Was she really going to choose herself over keeping the peace? She looked at Harold's photograph on the nightstand. In the picture, he was laughing, his arm around her, both of them covered in paint from redecorating the kitchen. They looked so happy, so in love, so hopeful about their future in this house. "What would you do, Harold?" she whispered to the photograph. But deep down, she already knew the answer. Harold had never let anyone disrespect her. Harold had always been her protector, her champion, her advocate. Now she would have to be her own. Dorothy picked up her pen and began to write. The next evening, Dorothy prepared dinner with unusual care. Not because she expected appreciation, she'd learned that lesson, but because she wanted this meal to be perfect for what she had to do. She made Harold's favorite, roast chicken with herbs from the garden they'd planted together, mashed potatoes with real butter, and green beans from the same patch they'd tended for 20 years. For dessert, she'd baked a lemon cake using her mother's recipe, the one that had won the county fair 3 years running. As the family gathered around the table, Dorothy noticed the familiar pattern. Marcus absorbed in his phone, Jennifer scrolling through social media, Kyle and Madison complaining about having to eat real food instead of fast food. "This actually looks decent, Grandma," Madison said with surprise. "Like, almost normal." Jennifer picked at her chicken. "Dorothy, this is awfully heavy for dinner. Don't you think we should be eating lighter? I read an article about how eating late affects metabolism." Dorothy listened to the familiar criticism, but tonight it felt different. Tonight it felt like background noise, meaningless chatter that couldn't touch her anymore. "Before we finish eating," Dorothy said quietly, "I have something I need to share with all of you." She stood up slowly and walked to the kitchen, returning with a manila envelope. Her hands were steady as she placed it on the table between the salt and pepper shakers. "What's this, Mom?" Marcus asked, finally looking up from his phone. "It's a legal notice," Dorothy said, resuming her seat. "I had my lawyer prepare it." Jennifer's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. "Your lawyer?" Dorothy nodded toward the envelope. "Marcus, would you please read it out loud?" Marcus exchanged a glance with Jennifer before reluctantly opening the envelope. He pulled out the official-looking document and began to read. "Notice to vacate. To Marcus Williams, Jennifer Williams, Kyle Williams, and Madison Williams. You are hereby notified that your tenancy of the premises located at 1247 Maple Street is hereby terminated. You are required to quit and surrender said premises to Dorothy Williams, the owner thereof, within 30 days. Marcus's voice trailed off as the words sank in. The room fell completely silent except for the ticking of Harold's grandfather clock in the corner. Jennifer was the first to react. This is a joke, right? Dorothy, tell me this is some kind of joke. Dorothy met her daughter-in-law's eyes steadily. It's not a joke, Jennifer. You can't evict us. Jennifer's voice rose to a shriek. This is our home. We live here. We pay bills here. You pay some expenses, Dorothy corrected calmly. But you don't pay rent, and you're not on the deed. According to the law, that makes you tenants who can be asked to leave with proper notice. Marcus stared at his mother as if seeing her for the first time. Mom, you can't be serious. Where would we go? The kids' school, our jobs, everything is here. You should have thought about that before you decided I was unwelcome in my own home, Dorothy replied. Kyle looked between his parents and grandmother, confusion evident on his young face. Wait, are we getting kicked out? By Grandma? Madison started to cry. But this is our house. I've lived here since I was little. Dorothy felt a pang of sympathy for her grandchildren, but she also remembered their laughter as they threw her food in the trash, their casual cruelty, their participation in her daily humiliation. You've lived here as guests in my house, Dorothy said gently but firmly. And guests should treat their host with respect. Jennifer shot to her feet, her chair scraping against the floor. Respect? You want respect? Dorothy, you're a bitter old woman living in the past. You can't accept that times change, that people change. You want us to pretend it's still 1985, eating your heavy food and tiptoeing around your feelings. I want you to treat me like a human being, Dorothy said, her voice still calm but gaining strength. I want you to remember that I'm the woman who raised Marcus, who worked 2 jobs to put food on this table, who opened my home to all of you because I thought family meant something. Marcus ran his hands through his hair, looking desperate. Mom, okay, maybe we haven't been as considerate as we should be. But eviction? That's extreme. We can work this out. Work it out. Dorothy's laugh was bitter. Marcus, yesterday Jennifer told me my cooking belongs in the garbage, just like I do. Last week, Cal called me just another old person with problems. You sit silent while your wife rearranges my furniture and throws away my belongings. When exactly did you plan to start working it out? Jennifer's face had turned red with rage.
Fine.
You want to play hardball, Dorothy? Let's play hardball. You think you can survive without us? You're 78 years old. You can barely remember to take your medications. What happens when you fall and break your hip? What happens when you can't drive anymore? What happens when? What happens is that I'll face those challenges in my own home, surrounded by people who actually care about me, Dorothy interrupted. Not people who see me as a burden they're stuck with. People who care about you. Jennifer laughed harshly. Dorothy, look around. We're the only people in your life. Your neighbors barely know you exist. You have no friends left. We're all you have, and you're throwing us away over hurt feelings. The words hit their mark, and Dorothy felt a moment of doubt. Was she making the biggest mistake of her life? Was Jennifer right about her isolation, her dependence? But then she remembered yesterday morning, when she'd woken to find Jennifer had thrown away her coffee maker because it was outdated, replacing it with some complicated machine Dorothy couldn't figure out how to use. She remembered Jennifer's voice in the darkness. When she's gone, this whole house is ours. 30 days, Dorothy said quietly but firmly. The notice is legal and binding. George Whitmore made sure of that. Marcus leaned forward desperately. Mom, please. Think about what you're doing. You're destroying our family over what? Some hurt feelings about dinner? Some disagreements about decorating? I'm trying to save what's left of my dignity, Dorothy replied. And maybe, if I'm very lucky, I'm trying to save what's left of my family by showing them that love without respect is just manipulation. Jennifer grabbed her purse and keys. Fine, Dorothy. You want to be alone? You want to prove how independent you are? Enjoy your empty house and your bitter memories. But don't come crawling back to us when reality hits. Where are you going? Marcus called after her. To call my sister. And then I'm calling a lawyer of our own. If Dorothy wants to fight, we'll fight. As Jennifer stormed out, slamming the door behind her, Marcus turned to his mother with a look Dorothy had never seen before, a mixture of disappointment, anger, and something that looked almost like hatred. "You'll regret this, Mom," he said quietly. "You think you're proving some point, but all you're proving is that you'd rather be right than be happy. You'd rather nurse old grudges than accept that people aren't perfect." He stood up, gathering his confused children. "Come on, kids. Let's go find your mother." As they filed out, Madison looked back at Dorothy with tears in her eyes. "I don't understand, Grandma. I thought you loved us." "I do love you," Dorothy whispered, but they were already gone. Alone in her dining room, surrounded by the remains of the dinner no one had finished, Dorothy looked at Harold's empty chair and whispered, "Did I do the right thing, Harold? Or have I just destroyed everything we worked to build?" The grandfather clock chimed 9 times, the only answer she would get. 25 days after serving the eviction notice, Dorothy stood in her kitchen making coffee with her old coffee maker, the one she'd rescued from the garbage after Jennifer had discarded it. The house was quiet in a way it hadn't been in years, but it was a peaceful quiet, not the tense silence of unspoken resentment. Marcus and Jennifer had found a rental house across town. The transition had been ugly. Jennifer had made sure of that. She'd hired a lawyer who'd tried unsuccessfully to challenge the eviction, claiming Dorothy was mentally incompetent. When that failed, Jennifer had made several attempts to guilt Dorothy into changing her mind, including bringing the children by to cry and plead. The hardest part had been watching Kyle and Madison's confusion and pain. They didn't understand why their grandmother had turned mean, as Madison put it. Dorothy's heart broke every time she thought about their hurt faces, but she also remembered their casual cruelty, their participation in her daily humiliation. George Whitmore had been right about one thing. Evicting family was legally straightforward, but emotionally devastating. But as Dorothy sat in Harold's chair with her morning coffee, looking out at the garden that was finally blooming the way she and Harold had intended, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Peace. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize. "Mrs. Williams? This is Sarah Chen from Grace Methodist Church. Pastor Williams gave me your number." Dorothy smiled. Pastor Williams, no relation despite the name, had been a good friend to her and Harold. "How can I help you, dear?" "Well, actually, I was hoping I could help you. Pastor Williams mentioned you might have some space to rent. I'm a nurse at the hospital, working night shifts, and I'm looking for a quiet place to stay. Somewhere with a little garden maybe, where I could have some peace between shifts." Dorothy looked around her empty house, thinking about the silence that had felt so healing but sometimes, in the evenings, felt a little lonely. "Tell me about yourself, Sarah." Over the course of a 20-minute conversation, Dorothy learned that Sarah was a widow herself, that she loved cooking and gardening, that she was looking for a place where she could contribute to a household rather than just exist in an apartment. She was quiet, respectful, and mentioned that she'd grown up helping her grandmother maintain a house very similar to Dorothy's. "Could you come by this afternoon for tea?" Dorothy asked impulsively. "I'd like to meet you in person." Sarah arrived promptly at 3, carrying a small bouquet of flowers from her current apartment's garden. She was a petite woman in her 50s with gentle eyes and laugh lines that spoke of someone who found joy despite life's hardships. They talked for 2 hours. Sarah admired Dorothy's china, asked about the history of the house, and showed genuine interest in Harold's garden. When Dorothy mentioned she sometimes struggled with the upkeep, Sarah offered to help with the heavier work in exchange for reduced rent. "I miss having a garden," Sarah admitted. "My grandmother and I used to grow the most beautiful tomatoes. She always said plants grew better when they felt loved." Dorothy thought Harold would have liked Sarah Chin very much. Within a week, Sarah had moved into Marcus's old room. The change in the house was immediate and wonderful. Sarah was an early riser like Dorothy, and they fell into a comfortable routine of sharing morning coffee and evening tea. Sarah cooked healthy but flavorful meals, often teaching Dorothy new techniques while learning some of Dorothy's traditional recipes in return. "Your pot roast recipe is incredible," Sarah said one evening as they prepared dinner together. My grandmother would have loved this. You'll have to teach me to make your biscuits, too. Dorothy felt a warmth she hadn't experienced in years. Her cooking was appreciated again, valued, requested rather than tolerated or mocked. 2 weeks later, Pastor Williams called with another referral. Dorothy, I have a gentleman from the congregation who's looking for a place to rent. Robert Martinez just retired from teaching high school history. His wife passed last year, and he's finding that apartment living doesn't suit him. He's handy with repairs and maintenance, loves to read, and makes the best coffee cake I've ever tasted. Dorothy thought about Harold's study, which had been sitting empty since Marcus moved out. She thought about having someone in the house who appreciated history, who understood loss, who might enjoy quiet evenings and good conversation. Robert Martinez turned out to be a silver-haired gentleman with kind eyes and rough hands that spoke of someone who'd spent his life building things. He brought Dorothy a small coffee cake as an introduction gift and spent an hour looking at Harold's books with genuine interest. Your husband had excellent taste in history texts, Robert said, running his fingers along the spines of Harold's collection. I'd love to hear about his experiences, if you'd be willing to share them sometime. Dorothy found herself smiling, really smiling, for the first time in months. Harold would have enjoyed talking with you, Robert. He loved discussing history, especially local history. He knew every family that had lived in this neighborhood going back 50 years. Within a month, Dorothy's house had transformed from a place of tension and resentment into a warm, welcoming home filled with mutual respect and genuine affection. Sarah worked her night shifts at the hospital and spent her days tending the garden with Dorothy, teaching her about companion planting and organic fertilizers. Robert had taken over the maintenance tasks that had been weighing on Dorothy's mind, fixing leaky faucets, cleaning gutters, touching up paint where needed. Most importantly, they both treated Dorothy not as a burden to be managed, but as the owner of the home who was graciously sharing her space with them. They asked permission before making changes, contributed to household decisions, and showed genuine appreciation for Dorothy's cooking, her stories, and her wisdom. The three of them fell into comfortable routines, morning coffee together before Sarah went to sleep after her shift, afternoon conversations about books and current events with Robert, evening meals where all three contributed something to the table. The house filled with the kind of laughter Dorothy remembered from her early years with Harold, genuine, warm, unforced. One evening in late autumn, as Dorothy was preparing her famous apple pie, the doorbell rang. Through the window, she saw Marcus standing on the front porch, looking uncertain and slightly older than she remembered. Dorothy opened the door, but didn't immediately invite him in. Hello, Marcus. Hi, Mom. I was hoping we could talk. Dorothy studied her son's face. Gone was the entitled attitude, the dismissive expression she'd grown accustomed to. He looked humbled, perhaps even ashamed. Come in, she said finally. Marcus entered the living room and stopped short. The house looked lived in and loved again. Fresh flowers sat on the coffee table, books were stacked on the side tables, and the smell of dinner cooking filled the air. Through the kitchen doorway, he could see Sarah chopping vegetables while humming softly. You have roommates? He asked. I have housemates, Dorothy corrected. Friends who share my home and my life. People who contribute to our household and appreciate what I contribute to theirs. Marcus winced at the implied criticism. Mom, I came to. I wanted to apologize. Jennifer and we weren't fair to you. We took advantage of your generosity, and we took you for granted. Dorothy gestured for him to sit down, noting that he didn't automatically claim Harold's chair as he once had. Go on. Living on our own has been harder than we expected, not just financially, but I realized how much you did for us, how much you gave us, and I realized how little we gave back. Dorothy waited, saying nothing. Jennifer's been struggling with the adjustment. The kids miss you, miss this house. Madison asks about you constantly. Cal's been having problems at school. I think the move and the instability affected him more than we realized. And you, Marcus? How are you doing? Marcus ran his hands through his hair, a gesture Dorothy remembered from his childhood when he was working up the courage to confess some misdeed. I'm ashamed, Mom. I'm ashamed of how we treated you. Ashamed of how I let Jennifer speak to you. Ashamed that I forgot. that I forgot who raised me and how much you sacrificed for our family." Dorothy felt tears prick her eyes, but they were complicated tears: relief, sadness, hope, and weariness all mixed together. "I've missed you," she said softly. "I've missed my son. But I don't miss the way you made me feel in my own home." "I know. And I don't know if you can forgive me, but I want to try to earn back your trust. Your love." Before Dorothy could respond, Sarah appeared in the doorway. "Dorothy, dinner's ready whenever you—" "Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't know you had company." "Sarah, this is my son Marcus." "Marcus, this is Sarah, one of my housemates." Sarah smiled warmly and extended her hand. "It's wonderful to meet you, Marcus. Dorothy talks about you often." Marcus looked surprised. "She does?" "Of course. You're her son. She loves you very much, even when—" Sarah's smile faltered slightly as she realized she might be overstepping. "Even when I was being an ungrateful fool," Marcus finished quietly. Robert appeared from the study, drawn by the voices. "Dorothy, everything all right?" "Robert, this is my son Marcus." "Marcus, Robert is my other housemate." Robert shook Marcus's hand firmly. "Your mother's told us so much about you. She's very proud of the man you became, despite recent difficulties." Marcus looked around at these strangers who seemed to know him, who spoke of his mother with genuine affection and respect. The contrast to how he and his family had been living was stark and painful. "Would you like to stay for dinner?" Dorothy asked quietly. "There's plenty." Marcus looked toward the kitchen, where he could see a beautifully set table, real food being prepared with care, the kind of meal his mother used to make when he was young and still appreciated her efforts. "I'd like that very much," he said. "If it's not an imposition." "You're never an imposition, Marcus," Dorothy said. "You're my son, but you're also a guest in my home now, and guests are expected to be respectful and appreciative." "I understand, Mom. And I am respectful and appreciative." That dinner was the beginning of a slow rebuilding. Marcus came by every Sunday, sometimes alone, sometimes with Kyle and Madison. Jennifer remained notably absent, still too proud and angry to admit her mistakes. The children were awkward at first, unsure how to behave with the grandmother they'd taken for granted, but Dorothy's love for them was unchanged, even if her willingness to be walked over was gone. Over the months that followed, Marcus proved his sincerity through actions rather than words. He helped with yard work when asked. He brought groceries when Dorothy mentioned needing them. He listened when she talked about Harold, about the past, about her hopes for the future. Most importantly, he treated her like the competent, valuable woman she was, not like a burden or an obligation. 1 year after the eviction notice, Dorothy stood in her kitchen making Christmas cookies with Sarah while Robert decorated the tree with ornaments that held decades of memories. Marcus was coming for Christmas dinner with the children. Jennifer had finally agreed to come too, though the apology conversations were still ongoing. The house smelled like cinnamon and pine and happiness. The rooms were filled with voices and laughter and the kind of love that's built on mutual respect rather than obligation. As Dorothy pulled a batch of Harold's favorite sugar cookies from the oven, she caught sight of his photograph on the refrigerator. In the picture, he was laughing, his arm around her, both of them covered in flour from some long-ago baking session. "I kept the house, Harold," she whispered to his image. "And I finally kept myself." Through the kitchen window, she could see Marcus teaching Kyle how to properly rake leaves, both of them laughing when Kyle accidentally raked himself into a pile. In the living room, Sarah was showing Madison how to knit while Robert read a story to some children from the neighborhood who'd come by to see Dorothy's famous Christmas decorations. Dorothy Williams looked around her home, truly her home now, and realized that sometimes you have to be willing to lose everything in order to discover what's actually worth keeping. Sometimes love means setting boundaries. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is demand the respect you deserve. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, the people who truly love you will rise to meet that demand. The doorbell rang, and Dorothy could hear Marcus calling, "Mom, we're here. And we brought dessert." Dorothy smiled, untied her apron, and went to welcome her family home. Dorothy Williams sat on her front porch swing, the same swing where she and Harold had spent countless evenings watching the sunset. Beside her sat her newest housemate, Elena, a young teacher who reminded Dorothy of herself at that age, determined, optimistic, and occasionally in need of motherly advice. The house behind them buzzed with gentle activity. Sarah was in the garden teaching a small group of neighborhood children about composting. Robert was in Harold's study, now transformed into a community meeting space where he led a weekly book club for local seniors. The kitchen table held Elena's lesson plans for the next week and Dorothy's recipe cards. Elena was determined to learn every family recipe Dorothy was willing to share. Marcus visited every Sunday, bringing his children and, increasingly often, bringing Jennifer, who had slowly, grudgingly, begun to understand what she'd lost and what she needed to do to earn it back. The conversations weren't always easy, but they were honest in a way they'd never been before. As Dorothy rocked gently on the swing, watching Sarah show little Katie from next door how to identify different types of soil, she reflected on how much had changed since that terrible night when her family had thrown her dinner in the trash. She'd learned that being alone and being lonely were two different things. She discovered that her house could be filled with love without being filled with people who took that love for granted. She'd found that setting boundaries wasn't cruel, it was necessary for survival. Most importantly, she'd learned that she was stronger than she'd ever imagined. Strong enough to demand respect. Strong enough to start over. Strong enough to build a new kind of family based on choice rather than obligation. The sun was setting behind the oak tree Harold had planted for their 20th anniversary, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Dorothy closed her eyes and felt the evening breeze carry the scent of Sarah's roses, the new variety they'd planted together, more resilient than the old ones, but just as beautiful. "Harold," she whispered to the wind, "I think you would have liked how this story ended." From inside the house came the sound of laughter, genuine, warm, respectful laughter, and Dorothy Williams smiled, knowing she was finally, truly home. Dorothy's story reminds us that it's never too late to reclaim your dignity, your home, and your happiness. Sometimes the greatest act of love is refusing to accept anything less than the respect you deserve. If you've ever felt undervalued in your own home, remember Dorothy's courage and know that you, too, have the power to demand better. Subscribe for more inspiring stories. Did Dorothy's journey touch your heart? You're not alone. Thousands of viewers have shared how Dorothy's courage inspired them to stand up for themselves in their own lives. Her story proves that age is just a number when it comes to finding your inner strength and demanding the respect you deserve. Smash that like button if Dorothy's transformation inspired you. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Have you ever felt unappreciated in your own home? What would you have done in Dorothy's situation? Do you know someone who needs to hear Dorothy's story? Subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss stories like Dorothy's. Every week, we share real-life tales of ordinary people who found extraordinary courage to change their lives. Coming up next, she discovered her husband's secret room after 30 years of marriage. What she found inside changed everything. Share this story with someone who needs to remember their own worth. Sometimes we all need a reminder that it's never too late to choose yourself. Remember, you teach people how to treat you. Dorothy learned this at 78, but you don't have to wait that long. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next story. God bless you.